introduce a couple of other folks in this lecture series, and I have jumped at the chance every time because they're some of the best people I know, and Charlie is at the top of that list. Charlie's tired of me telling this story, but I'm going to tell the story, the condensed version, which is that I met him when I was a lowly graduate student. It was probably 1997 or 98. I had just finished up a master's in wild turkeys at SUNY ESF, and I was considering whether to stick around and do a PhD at ESF. And my dad and I traveled around. My dad helped me to think about this decision by traveling around with me to talk to people, all of whom had jobs that I thought were super cool, like Charlie's, some of whom had a PhD and some of whom didn't. And without fail, all of the ones who had a PhD, like Charlie, all said, yes, absolutely, you should get a PhD. And all the ones who didn't have a PhD said, why would you waste your time getting a PhD? You should definitely go get some job experience. And I listened to Charlie, and I stayed, and I got the PhD. And I always wonder what he thinks of that, and whether you give that same advice to students who darken your door now when they show up at the Carey Institute. But since that time, he has always been, and always will be, a tremendous role model for me. I won't tell you about his work because he's going to tell you about his work, but I'll just tell you some of the things that I appreciate, and that is that he is a tremendous source of knowledge, and you really get the sense when you talk to Charlie that he is telling you how he feels about something, not based on any sort of gut feeling about it, but because he really has invested an enormous amount of time to study it and to look at the information. And in his case, that is hundreds of thousands of data points, and doing the analysis himself, sophisticated kinds of analytical methods to help him understand the patterns that he sees in the data. And that similarly is a model that I have tried to emulate for a long time. Ask me how I feel about something, I'll tell you after I've studied it for a decade. That's something that I have learned from Charlie. Last summer, during the height of the COVID times, I guess, he and I were asked to do a Zoom webinar for the Adirondack Land Trust about Adirondack forests, flora and fauna. And Charlie talked about the woods, and I talked about the wildlife. I'm a terrestrial wildlife person, and I am the first to tell you that I'm totally guilty of looking at the forest not for any inherent interest in the trees, but because they are habitat for the animals that I'm interested in. And I don't have any interest in counting the trees, but Charlie does. And whenever somebody asks me about the forest, about the future of the forest, about what the things are we should be worried about, the forces that dominate and perpetuate it, and what the future is, the first thing I do is go get one of his papers and read it, and that's where my answer comes from. So I hope that he knows how important he has been to me and to many, many others. And I hope that you'll join me in welcoming Dr. Charlie Canham.
Well, thank you, McKaylee. Yeah, Bob has vivid memories of that meeting as well. And I do, it's funny, I don't always give that advice to students. The real advice is only do it if you really want to do it. And it worked. I feel confident that I know that it worked really well for McKaylee. So thanks for the invitation to speak tonight. I'm going to talk about the way that after about 45 years of thinking about northeastern forests, the currents that I think will shape their future. I'm a forest ecologist. I study the dynamics of forests. I've worked in many different parts of the world, but I did my PhD research in the Five Ponds Wilderness thanks to Ed Kethledge. I was a Cornell student, actually, not an ESF student, and my advisor at Cornell was wise enough to tell me that if I was going to work in New York, I needed to go up to Syracuse and meet Ketch, and he got me the permission to work in Five Ponds, and I spent 3 marvelous summers there doing my PhD research. And then I went off and worked in many other parts of the world, but it was really the 95 blowdown. We were back doing some research off a Stillwater reservoir, and I had been, basically an ecologist for hire. I'd been working in British Columbia, New Zealand, Puerto Rico, helping them think about management and ecology of their forests. And I realized that I wasn't working where, in the places I cared about the most. And Governor Pataki put together a committee to think about whether to salvage log after the blowdown, which was a really bad idea, and did not happen because Clarence Petty stood up in front of the park agency and said, I was here in '51 and it was a nightmare when you let people salvage log. I then got up and rattled on about the ecological reasons why you shouldn't salvage log after a blowdown. But at that meeting, Kathy Regan sort of pulled me aside and asked if I would join the board of the Adirondack chapter of the Nature Conservancy. And it was sort of just what I was looking for. It was a way to get engaged here locally. And so, but I work at an institute in the Hudson Valley called the Carey Institute. It's a pretty remarkable place, a small private nonprofit institute with about 16 full-time ecologists. We work on everything from Lyme disease ecology to the ecology of oceans, and a lot of disease ecology, a lot of different kinds of things. And it's given me the opportunity to spend basically full-time for more than 40 years now just thinking about forests. And a couple of years ago, an editor, a friend at Yale, talked me into writing a book. Actually, Bruce was my reader for this. I thought, you know, I'd like to try to figure out a way to tell the stories that I've learned from years of full-time research in a way that maybe you might appreciate. I have to warn you, if you buy the book, that chapter 2 is tough. Both my wife and my PhD advisor told me it was way too technical. And but if you get past it, there's some good stories in it. So I'm going to just talk about the way that I see the future of northeastern forests, and I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to start by just giving you a sense of how forest ecologists think about the tapestry that's out there. Just a slide or two about what was here prior to European settlement. And I'm not going to get into that in much detail, but there are a couple of key points there. And then I'm just going to sort of work through in very short order, just with my take-home messages about how all of these other factors are influencing the future of northeastern forests. You probably, you know, would have expected me to put climate change at the top. It's actually at the bottom for a good reason. I think these forests are, in fact, eastern forests, temperate forests of North America in general, are among the most resilient to climate change of any ecosystems on the planet. But nonetheless, all of these things are shaping what we're likely to see in the future. So, first, this is probably hard to see. The point is exactly that. So we tend to think that there is some key or central or iconic set of species here. And a group of us were out walking the trails this afternoon, and there are a couple of species that really stand out. But the point of this is that almost all of the species you think of as sort of Adirondack tree species have incredibly broad distributions. So beech is in many ways the most iconic Adirondack tree, but it grows from Nova Scotia to Mexico. But nowhere in that range is it more dominant and abundant than in the Adirondacks. Another one would be red spruce. But if you think about this, you know the Adirondacks are characterized by a bunch of northern conifers that are at their southern range limit, balsam fir, you know, the various spruce species, but more by the absence of the oaks. And so yes, you know, if you drive up along the Hudson between Warrensburg and Indian Lake, you're going to see lots of oaks along the river banks and the lower slopes, particularly this time of year when the oaks still have their leaves. I'm always surprised at how much oak. But the bottom line is, these are northern forests, but the species that you might think of as iconic northern species, many of them have very broad distributions, and there are no natural groupings of these species into clearly identifiable forests. And so, you know, the saying, you can't see the forest for the trees, well, for me, the forest is the trees. And a forest is made up of a mix of species, but that mix of species is going to vary. If I'm standing here, it's going to be something uniquely different over there. And the work I've been doing for 40 years now has been designed to let me understand how, as I walk through the woods, what's happening right here, where I put my foot down, as opposed to what's happening when I walk on, you know, to the other end of this building and I have a different set of trees immediately around me. So that's sort of what I call a neighborhood ecology. It's basically what's important in the ecology of that forest is happening right here, literally within 10 or 15 meters of where I'm standing. This is my slide to walk you through what's happened over the last 12,000 years here. So the way this work is done is that you take a liquid nitrogen cooled core and you drop it in a lake, and it freezes the sediment, and then you pull it out and you take that sediment and you cut your way back, take out little slices of it, and analyze the pollen grains preserved for the last 12,000 years in that sediment. And so this has been done all over the Northeast. You can in fact go online and download the data for your favorite lake. This is one of my favorites. This is Don Whitehead and Steve Jackson's famous study from Heart Lake, right in the high peaks. And the point here is that typically paleontologists would stand here and they'd look at this and say, well, there must be something here. What was the climate happening here? Well, yes, there are things like that you can pick out here. But when I look at this, what I see is just endless change. And at no point in those 10, 12,000 years is there anything that I would consider equilibrium, where the tree species have stabilized and they're driven entirely by climate. There are a couple of really distinctive things here. The first is that, hemlock, only, around 9,000 years you start to pick up hemlock pollen. Beech about the same time, but takes longer. But then about 5,000 years ago, hemlock disappears from eastern North America. And this signal was present in almost every lake you can look at in the Northeast. Margaret Davis was one of the pioneers of this kind of work, and she proposed almost 40 years ago that this was because an insect got introduced to eastern North America, probably, we believe, a western hemlock looper, an insect that probably got blown over by a storm system. Population must have gotten established. And literally within a couple hundred years, hemlock crashes all across the east. Now, there are some folks now who are trying to argue, climate is on everybody's explanation list now, and there are people trying to argue that this is climate. I don't buy it at all. I see no basis for a climate signal for this. But what you notice is that beech really takes off. And beech and hemlock are about the closest competitors in these forests. And then hemlock takes about 1,000 years to recover from this single event. And the models we built to try to look at how things like insects and climate affect forests actually predict that if you have this big an impact on a species, it can in fact take 1,000 years for the population to recover. So this should not be very comforting if you think about what's happening with hemlock woolly adelgid. And in fact, we predict that beech took off and benefited. Both species have been declining for 4,000 years, and that's actually still something that does not have to be a climate signal. It could simply be that that's how long it takes for these populations to stabilize after an event like a single insect wiping out all the hemlocks in the Northeast. So there's just an enormous amount of variation. And the reason I bring this up is that we still have this notion of this primeval forest, that there was some natural state that we would hope that these forests could get back to. But you look at this, I still don't understand why it's only in the last 2,000 years that the spruces have reappeared in this record. And no one really knows why that's the case. So. And this is, I'm not going to say much about Native American impacts, except again to bring this up to mention, to essentially describe the way I think about the forest prior to European arrival. I don't think we're ever going to know whether the original humans on this continent were responsible for the extinction of the incredible number of, basically everything bigger than the American bison went extinct about, at the end of the Ice Age. For a long time, this was believed to be precipitated by the arrival of Native American hunters, particularly the Clovis Point people. Now it's much more common now to argue that this was probably due to climate change, but this mastodon was a forest dweller. And so the point here is that we don't know why these things went extinct, but there's actually no evidence that their extinction changed the forests. Now, absence of evidence is not absence of you know what I'm trying to say. It's just not clear what I would look for to see if mastodons were structuring those early forests. We just don't have any way of knowing. I'll talk a fair bit about fire regimes. The Adirondacks have very different fire regimes than the part of the world where I live in the Hudson Valley, those oak forests where it's believed that Native Americans did in fact use fire heavily. But even that is now debated. So we really don't know to what degree Native Americans were deliberately using fire to manage the landscape. And of course, agriculture, maize only arrives in the Northeast about 1,000 years ago. So active agriculture is a fairly recent phenomenon in Native American culture. Before that, they were primarily hunter-gatherers. And it's just not clear how much land was ever cleared, particularly in a place with frankly, pretty lousy soils like much of the interior of the Adirondacks. Down in the Hudson Valley, where I live, there was heavy reliance on the Hudson River or on seafood along Long Island Sound. And the agriculture was really even there restricted to just the best soils along the river valleys, the floodplains, the old beaver meadows, and so forth. So yes, there's a lot of uncertainty about just exactly what impact Native American culture had on forests of the Adirondacks or the Northeast. But the bottom line is that it's really difficult to tease out much in the way of an impact on the nature of eastern forests. But there's no question that the arrival of Europeans was just a major turning point. Again, more so, this would be more applicable down where I live, anywhere south of the Mohawk, southern New England, or along the Champlain, where the soils are better. But the magnitude of the land clearing is really, and the industriousness of this land clearing is really hard to wrap your minds around. I live in Dutchess County. The land where I live was purchased by land speculators in Manhattan in 1690. They purchased 250,000 acres of Dutchess County in 1690 to trap beaver for the hat trade in London. And 30, 40 years later, the Royal Crown sold them the land to subdivide it to make it available to farmers, and they were holding on to it. So they got sued by the governor, and they had to start subdividing the land. So where my house is, by about 1750, that land was being sold off to farmers, and wheat was actually the first crop. The Hudson Valley was the breadbasket for the early colonies, and they were carving out a couple of acres out of maybe the 10 acres they owned and planting wheat. Actually, the wheat crop crashed very quickly due to a couple of pests introduced from England, and by 1820, the land was exhausted, the Erie Canal opened, and the town where I live, our population dropped from that point and didn't recover until 1950. So once the Erie Canal opened, with the access, the Erie Canal meant that you could go to Ohio and you could then ship your produce back across the canal to Albany, down the Hudson, and then transship it across to Europe. And so, this pattern of clearing and then intensive agriculture, abandonment, and recovery went across all through southern New England. Dutchess County, again, at the low point, was only about 15% forested. Just about 100 years ago, it's now 60% forested. But all of those forests went through this bottleneck of having been cleared, put into agriculture, and then allowed to recover. And that process creates entirely new communities. So most of my yard was an old dairy farm, and it was abandoned from pasture. And so I have oaks all through, because the farmers left oaks in the woods. They provided shade for the livestock, and they also provided acorns for the livestock. But if a cultivated field was abandoned, it got colonized by an entirely new set of species that have no analog in the historical record. These forests that have come in on abandoned cultivated fields, there's nowhere in the 12,000 year history that you find that mix of species. So these are entirely new communities on the landscape, and solely because of a history of land use. But here in the Adirondacks, yes, agriculture was present. It was far more localized, but forestry was just an enormous impact on the landscape, but in a very fundamentally different way than in these more agricultural landscapes. And it's really, this is a picture from one of Barbara Martin's wonderful books. The hemlock tanning industry is really a remarkable story. So the Catskills were completely denuded of trees between about 1810 and 1830, with the hides brought from Argentina on clipper ships and then hauled into the Catskills, because it was easier to haul hides to the hemlock bark than it was to haul the hemlock bark to the hides. But by about 1830, 1840, the Catskills, the forests were gone. In fact, hemlock still has not recovered the abundance it had before the tanning industry. And then the tanneries moved to the southern flanks of the Adirondacks. And Barbara's book is wonderful reading, as all of her books are. And that industry, so there were hundreds of tanneries on the, just north of the Mohawk up into the southern flanks of the Adirondacks. And they lasted about 30 years. And then they had exhausted all the hemlock. And then the tanneries moved to northern Wisconsin. And then soon after that, they worked out how to get tannin from oaks, and hemlock started to recover. But of course, the logging we think of in the Adirondacks, that early logging was just for the conifers in the river valleys, because that's what you could float down the river. And so Barbara's wonderful book called The Great Forest of the Adirondacks is just, it's classic Barbara. It's all over the place, but just wonderful stories. And a lot of these forests had just their large spruce removed, say 1860, 1870, up to about 1890. The question is, could you tell if you went into those forests now? And so Barbara and Ed Kettelich and Peter Marks and I walked a bunch of these forests many years ago, and I would maintain that there's absolutely no way that I could tell whether or not the spruce had been removed this 130 years later. And so there's an awful lot of Adirondack forest that, yes, had some logging, but that is functionally old growth because it has went into the forest preserve and has been protected ever since. And this, we think of that early logging as having destroyed or transformed the landscape, but as a botanist and a plant ecologist, it had almost no impact on the understory. So the Adirondack forests that have gone through this wave of, in cases, it then became, well, I'll go back. There was much heavier logging later, but that logging had very little impact on the other species that make up the forest, all the shrubs and herbs and mosses and lichens. And so in many ways, these very heavily logged forests of the Adirondacks that have been allowed to recover within the forest preserve are closer to pre-settlement conditions than any other forests I know. It's just, and I don't know that message is often understood. But this clearly is to me, is the legacy of that logging. And the funny thing is that, of course, the timing of this is before the really intensive logging happened. But that early logging was enough to trigger this remarkable accomplishment, the passage of the Florida Wild Amendment to the state constitution. And it was after that the narrow gauge railroads, once you build railroads, you can start to log the hardwoods because you don't have to float them. And clear cutting was widespread. And then these massive famous fires in 1903 and 1908, each of which burned hundreds of thousands of acres. Lots of people died, whole towns consumed. Large fires were burning out west. And so this gave rise to that era of fire suppression. So the fire towers that dot the landscape are a product of, basically the horror that came out of these massive fires. But I have to say that there's very little evidence that these fires were a natural phenomenon in this landscape prior to this era of lots of slash and lots of railroad engines like that one, which were supposed to have spark arresters but often did not, and were basically providing the source of ignition for these fires. So, since then, yes, fires do burn periodically in the Adirondacks, often at thin soils at high elevation or on some of the sandier soils around, particularly around here. But by and large, there's very little evidence in the historical record that fire was a common phenomenon in Adirondack forests prior to European settlement. And in fact, even during actually fires became quite common right after European settlement because people let fires get away. Humans were the source of ignition, and new settlers were starting a lot more fires than Native Americans ever did. And so, here in the Adirondacks, I'd be hard-pressed to say that this fire suppression has had a lasting legacy. But pretty much the rest of the country is dealing 100 years later with this history of suppressing fire. Now, in the East, it's a very different story than the West, and you all are, hearing about fires in the West. The problem in the West is that the longer you suppress fire, the more fuel you accumulate, and when a fire does burn, it's catastrophic. We actually have just the opposite here. The longer you suppress fires in eastern forests, the less flammable they get. And it's because Oaks produce really good fuel for fire in the spring. So oak leaves are the fuel that drive fires in eastern forests. And there's spring fires, and you get a good warm, dry spring day. If there's a source of ignition, a light ground fire will move through an oak forest very quickly. But the oaks with that thick bark are highly resistant to these fires, and you get very little actual death of oaks. Maples, on the other hand, can't tolerate fire. In fact, at the Carey Institute, when we, many years ago, I did a study. Actually, Dan Spada was my summer research assistant. Many of you know Dan from his years at the APA on this study. Oaks were the dominant species of the Cary forests in 1735, 1740, when those lands were subdivided. We know that from the records of the surveyors. Now, and there were no maples recorded by the surveyors. Now it's half oak, half maple, and this is almost certainly due to fire suppression, because the maples can't tolerate fire, and without fire, they come in pretty aggressively. But maple leaves decompose over winter because of their higher nitrogen content. And so in the spring, the more maple there is in the stand, the less fuel there is to burn in the spring. And so, in a very bizarre way, one of the big issues for us in the East with fire is that there's every reason to believe that oaks are going to continue to decline in abundance because of suppression of fire and because they're being displaced by maples. And it's really hard to see how to change that. Reintroducing controlled burns, works in the Pine Barrens in Albany because of really diligent work by the Nature Conservancy and the Pine Bush Commission. It works in New Jersey, it works on Cape Cod, where you've got these very fire-dependent pitch pine communities and a lot of money to spend managing the fires. But the neighborhood where I live is going to be maple-dominated forest in another 50, 100 years, and I guarantee you it was not 200 years ago. So this is a real issue. I don't see any way to reverse this trend, and it's going to play out over the next 100 to 200 years inexorably. This is another issue where I tend to get into trouble. The foresters and hunters often share common interests, but this is one where they don't. So the whitetail deer. So in the late 1800s, deer had already been eradicated from Connecticut. They had to be reintroduced to Connecticut in 1909 at a forest where I've worked for many years. The Game Commission estimated that there were 12 deer in the Catskills in the late 1800s. 12. The only population left in the Northeast was here in the Adirondacks, where it was believed there was a viable deer population. Hunting was banned in New York State from 1900 to World War II. And so in some ways, this is a remarkable sort of wildlife management success story, because deer populations, we really don't truly know what the early densities are, but there's a couple of classic studies that estimate maybe 10 per square mile. Down in southern New England, deer densities are at least 10 times that now, and they have an enormous impact. So, everybody does exposure studies. This is one that a colleague and I did in Dutchess County. I'm sure it's hard for you to see, but there's a fence here, and inside this is a nice healthy understory. Outside this, there's nothing taller than my mid-calf. This is on a property of a hunt club that plants crops so the deer, to feed the deer, even though they can't technically feed the deer. And they only shoot the bucks, so they won't shoot the does. And if you're not willing to shoot does, you cannot control a deer herd. And so for 45 years, at the Carey Institute, we've had a deer management program. And if you want to hunt on our property, you have to be willing to take a doe at least every other year, or else you're not invited back. And so our forests look like the area inside this fence. Everything around me in Dutchess County looks like this, with no understory. And I actually have a lot of neighbors who come up from New York City and think that this is what a forest should look like. And so they clear the understory, and then they rake all their leaves, and it drives me nuts. So they cut all the regeneration down, they take all the leaves out, and it looks like Central Park, but it's no longer a forest. I'm sorry, I had to put that in. I've got another neighbor doing that right now. It's driving me nuts. Again, this is probably more data than you want, but basically, at least half of northeastern forests are suffering from insufficient regeneration, not enough seedlings and saplings. Now eventually they're going to stay forests, they're going to regenerate eventually, but it takes longer, and so these forests are much less productive. And our analyses suggest that probably somewhere in the neighborhood of, a 25% reduction in forest productivity due to current densities of deer. But one thing you can maybe see in this slide is that the further north you get, the less the problem is, because deep snow is a problem for deer. And so, the deer, I was just looking at the wonderful shrubs at Tom Curley's place, but I didn't see a deer fence. In the Hudson Valley, none of those would survive. The deer would have taken them all out. And so, there's less of a problem here, but even so, the bulk of forest inventory plots in the Adirondacks show inadequate regeneration. There are a lot of reasons for this, but deer are clearly one of them. So I want to just talk for a couple of minutes. There's a forestry school very nearby, a very good one in fact. And I want to talk about, the public perception about forestry is difficult. One of the problems with forestry is that it's ugly. Really good forestry is really ugly. In fact, ecologists spent years trying to convince foresters to leave all the tops in the woods after a logging operation, because it's important habitat. There are a lot of nutrients in it. When I was an undergraduate in Montana, one of the most common summer jobs was to go out into clear cuts and gather up all the logging residue and burn it, and which then flushed all those nutrients into the streams. A lot of erosion, a lot of acidification. And in fact, leaving a lot of that stuff on the ground after a logging operation is actually good for the forest, but it sure doesn't look good. And in towns like mine down in the Hudson Valley, people they see a logging operation and they think it doesn't look good. In fact, they're probably right, but it works well for the forest. But this is what the public tends to think is really happening out there, which this is a picture I took from the back of Ed McNeil's air cam when we were doing lake sampling. This is a little bit west of Long Lake. But actually, and this is what would be called a variable retention patch cut. I have no idea why they left these trees here, or maybe they just haven't gotten to them yet. But actually, this is the area right over here. This was a small cut. Most of the area had been partially harvested like this. And this, in fact, is the way most eastern forests are now being logged. A lot of foresters think this is better forestry than this. I spent a lot of time in British Columbia working on alternatives to clear cutting, and I think this is very effective forestry if done well. This can be good forestry if done well. You need to know the forest, and you need to know the reasons why you're doing the logging. But this is, in fact, the way most forests in the East are logged now. Only about 10% of the area logged in any year in the Northeast is clear cut. The rest of it is cut in a way like this. And there are a lot of reasons for this. Particularly outside of the Adirondacks, where the land is owned by small family forests, they don't want to clear cut their land, but they're willing periodically to do some harvest. Often, the standard line is it's when the kids go off to college, or your daughter gets married, or you retire. That's when you think about logging, and there's some truth in all of that. But it's important to realize that logging, half of the trees that die in the eastern U.S. die because a human cut them down. That's not a value statement. That's straight out of forest inventory statistics. So logging is, in many ways, one of the key forces shaping the future of these forests. That's the way it is. And I think people tend to sort out into, you either want to have completely unlogged forests or very intensively managed forests. But a big chunk of the landscape is in that middle ground where there's management going on, and you hope that it's good management. This is maybe more data. I know this is more data than you want, but this keeps coming up that we keep looking to our forests to save us from climate change by sequestering carbon. And there's this perception that the Adirondacks are New York's major source of carbon sequestration in its forests. And that actually turns out not to be true. The Adirondacks are where the most intensively managed forests in New York exist. The big commercial timber investment management lands around the Adirondacks are actually very heavily managed. and are storing only, ignore the units, this is in cubic feet per acre per year, but it's the forests of eastern and western New York are basically storing 4 times as much carbon per acre per year as the working forests in the Adirondacks, and 2 to 3 times as much as the forests in Forest Preserve. And there are a couple of reasons for this. The real reason is, first, the climate and the soils here are not as productive as in those good sedimentary rock soils of western New York, or even the thinner soils of the Hudson Valley. But also, to be honest, beech still is a dominant part of Adirondack forests, and beech bark disease has been depressing productivity in Adirondack forests for almost 50 years now. So yes, these forests are still important sinks for carbon, but frankly, it's the small family forests of the rest of New York State are still producing enormous amounts of harvest, because there's 8 million acres of forest land in western New York compared to 5 in all of the Adirondacks. It's being logged much less heavily, but there's a lot of it, and it's producing a lot of high-value timber, and it's storing an enormous amount of carbon. So I just, both of these numbers are important. It's important that we continue to store carbon in these forests, but it's just also important to realize that other parts of the state are even more important. And so this selective logging, again, this is half of the mortality, and it's mortality that drives the direction a forest goes. And it is having impacts. It's selecting for the most shade-tolerant species, as opposed to something like black cherry or white ash, although all the white ash are dying anyway. And it is not producing good conditions for oaks. The oaks need more light, and this light selective logging is not helping the oaks. And then there's this issue of carbon markets, and I'm gonna talk about that in a minute, so I'm gonna jump on. I'm just gonna, air pollution. Many of you were around in the 1980s when we were concerned that the red spruce were all gonna die from acid rain. A lot of them did die. I remember a meeting at Glens Falls when the Forest Service had gone out and counted all of the trees that had died in the Northeast. And it was a very large number, but a lot of trees die naturally. But if you go out in the woods now, there are red spruce everywhere. The Clean Air Act was remarkably effective at reducing acid loading and acid rain in general, particularly sulfur dioxide, but also to a lesser degree the nitrogen inputs. But to be honest, in a somewhat perverse result, we discovered that all that nitrogen that was coming out of those smokestacks in Ohio was actually fertilizing these forests. In fact, we estimate that forests were about 40% more productive than they would have been prior to the industrial age, because we had fertilized them for 50 years with 7 or 8 kilograms per hectare per year of nitrogen. That's what this figure over here is. It's perverse, but that's what the data show us. It actually benefits only certain species. It particularly benefits sugar maple and black cherry, as opposed to the oaks and beech. So it's good for some species, not for others. But all of these others have been looked at closely. They all matter, but I have to say that the trees are not the sensitive organisms here. It's our lakes and our fish populations and the streams and rivers where the acid rain is really having an impact. Invasive species, everybody, you probably have things you like to pluck out of the woods because you know they don't belong there. I get in a fair bit of trouble by pointing out that yes, it's easy to clear your woods of garlic mustard. It's an invasive. It actually has, it produces a toxin that affects the fungi that the trees need, but it's not enough to really fundamentally alter the success of the trees. But the bottom line is that it's not displacing any native species in the woods. Species like tree of heaven, it produces a toxin from its roots that affects native tree seedlings, but again, not enough to fundamentally alter the dynamics of these forests. And so, the question is, compared to a wetland, these forests are not zero-sum games. You can add species. So 30% of the plant species in New York are non-native. Most of them, almost, and even the invasive ones, they were all brought here deliberately. Almost none of these plants were inadvertently introduced, except the weeds that came over with the first colonists in the Mayflower and the hay for them. So they were brought for horticulture or agriculture or forestry. And the real issues with invasives are not in these forests, they're in our wetlands and lakes. And so, you have to pick your battles. And so I've always been a very strong supporter of APIP, the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program. But the real things to worry about are not these forest invaders, but the things that get into our lakes and rivers. I'm gonna jump over because I have no idea what time it is, but I know I'm running late. But the one set of invasives that we do need to care about is this, and it's the forest pests and pathogens. This slide, again, it's pretty bright up here, but hopefully you can see just how. So this is the number of non-native forest pests per county in the U.S. And this is a fairly old paper of Sandy Liebold's, so these are 2012 data. So New York is ground zero for all of these things that have killed our trees: chestnut blight, Dutch elm disease, beech bark disease. Beech bark disease actually was introduced to Nova Scotia on a European beech sapling being brought over to the Royal Botanic Gardens in Nova Scotia. And then the disease has been spreading for 100 years. That was in 1896, I believe, and it's been spreading ever since. But many of these, have spread much more rapidly. Chestnut blight, Dutch elm disease. It actually, it's an Asian species of fungus that came over probably on an elm log being brought over for luthiers because the elm was being used to make instruments. So they're just, gypsy moths were of course introduced to produce silk. This nutcase in Boston in the 1850s thought he could produce silk from gypsy moths. It didn't work, and so he let them loose. We have gypsy moths. Hemlock woolly adelgid came from Japan. Emerald ash borer probably came over and emerged from wood packing material in Ohio about 15 years ago now. The Asian longhorn beetle, similarly, there's a new outbreak. I do a lot of work with APHIS, the federal agency that tries to control these. There's a new outbreak of Asian longhorn beetle in swamps outside of Charleston, South Carolina. Asian longhorn beetle is so terrifying that the federal government spends about $60 million a year trying to stop any known infestation. So Worcester, Mass. Was almost denuded of its trees to stop the infestation there. Chicago, New York, and a site in Ohio are pretty much under control. But this new site in Charleston is in these maple swamps full of alligators and cotton moccasins, or water moccasins. And so the question is, how do you get in there to find out whether the insect is there, and then how do you get the tree out? It's really quite scary. And so, for me, quite personally, since I did my PhD on the ecology of sugar maple and beech, there are a few resistant trees. So a few percent of beech trees are genetically resistant to this complex. So the insect bores holes in the bark. Those little tiny holes allow a fungus to get in, and the fungus causes these cankers. Causes these cankers on the trunk, and eventually that girdles the tree and kills the big ones, and then they sprout like mad and produce what's called scientifically beech hell, and familiar to any forester. And it's very hard. We really have no effective treatment for this at this point. In fact, for about the first 50, 60 years this was in the US, there was really no effort to try to control it. Beech was not considered a commercially important species. In fact, I think a lot of foresters 50 years ago thought, good, this will get rid of beech and we'll get more valuable trees in. Instead, what we've got are these forests that are constantly reinfected with beech bark disease. And beech is an incredibly competitive tree. It crowds out things in the understory. And so it's, yes, there are really intensive herbicide applications that can clear a forest. I've never favored or supported those efforts. I would much prefer that we find a way to stop the disease and allow these forests to recover. But certainly, beeches, Kaylee speak to this much better. It's our really our key hard mass species for wildlife. You know, those big beech nuts are very rare now because they are produced by the biggest trees, and all the big trees have died. So there would be lots of benefit if we could get this disease under control. I just want to say, give a shout out to a colleague of mine, Gary Levitt. Gary's got a place down by Minerva now where he spends most of the summer and a lot of the winter, actually, now that he and I are both semi-retired. Gary and I both studied these things for decades, and Gary finally decided it was time to stop studying it and figure out how to do something about it. And the data are very clear. There are two routes by which these things get here. They get here in the live plant trade, and they get here in solid wood packing. So we've offshored, you know, all those plants that Walmart sells, those, you know, for your annual gardens, and most of them come here from Central America. They used to be produced at nurseries and greenhouses in the U.S., but it's easier to produce them in Central America and ship them north. But the real problem for our trees is solid wood packing. So an insect, you know, oviposits, lays its eggs in a tree in China. That tree is cut down, turned into solid wood packing. It's supposed to be treated to kill the insects, but many of them are not. And the wood arrives wrapped around tractor parts, and then the insect emerges and says, wow, you know, the trees in China are very closely related to ours, and they hop right off. In fact, as best we can tell, that outbreak in Chicago, or in Charleston, the first detected infested tree is right behind a Tractor Supply warehouse. And almost certainly, this insect came out of untreated solid wood packing. There are lots of alternatives to solid wood packing. In fact, recycled plastic makes perfectly good solid wood packing. But there's actually a trade industry to promote solid wood packing in the US, and Gary has become public enemy #1. We know how to stop this importation of these insects. You know, as I was driving up this morning through all the way from the Hudson Valley, you know, the ashes would have by now lost their leaves, but they're actually mostly dead. And emerald ash borer is spreading faster than anything we've ever seen, and is killing more thoroughly than anything we've ever seen. So, you know, this is really an important issue. Okay, last one, climate change. What I really want to say here is that, you remember that first slide with all those dot maps of where species occur? Almost all of these tree species occur across a really broad range of climate. And, you know, in many cases, 12 to 15 degrees centigrade, right? So almost 20-degree Fahrenheit range of mean annual temperature. Again, beech grows from Nova Scotia to Mexico. The dotted lines here are actually the current mean annual temperatures for the 9 northeastern states. As low as about 2 or 3 in northern Maine, up to around 12 degrees mean annual temperature. Right here, you're probably at around 7, I would guess, maybe 6.5 here well, we're pretty far north. And so there are a whole lot of these species that as the climate warms, they're going to find this habitat more suitable. There are also species, particularly balsam fir, that is going to be in real trouble according to our data. But I've spent about 15 years working with the most expansive and thorough data sets we can assemble, and basically have concluded that what the data tell us is that the adult trees are largely insensitive to climate. So these are all species that have evolved over the last 10 to 20 million years for one key thing, and that is to tolerate climate extremes. So all of these species, remember, the climate here 40 million years ago was tropical. And in fact, the pole was tropical 50 million years ago. And as the continents drifted apart, CO2 levels declined, the Earth cooled, but the species that were able to tolerate these temperate climates were the ones that could tolerate freezing. Actually, that is the key evolutionary adaptation that defines our tree species. You have to be able to tolerate an Adirondack winter. But everybody can tolerate an Adirondack summer, right? And so these trees are incredibly plastic in their response to climate. Look at, you know, any one day can go from 40 in the morning to 80 at night. So there's an enormous body of research behind this conclusion, which is still an uncomfortable one that I haven't spent a lot of time highlighting, right? So we feed all this massive amount of information into this very sophisticated computer model that I've spent 30 years working on. And I ran the model for the northern forest, northern hardwood conifer forest, stretching from sort of Maine to Minnesota. And I thought, wow, not much happening there. In fact, sugar maple is predicted to increase, largely because of this partial harvesting that favors it. But then I ran the model for 1,000 years, and it just turns out that it takes about 150 years before things start to change, and then things change very rapidly. And it's because it's not the adults that are influenced by the change in climate, it's the seedlings. And even the saplings that are out there now are going to do quite well, even under a 3 degree centigrade change. Hopefully it won't be that large, but so our models actually predict that white pine and tulip poplar will replace sugar maple and beech in these forests. But it takes a long time. Forests are, they have their own, time cycles and time spans. And so, I truly do believe that these forests are among the most resilient ecosystems on the planet to climate change. So this will be how I wrap up, I guess. And it's, that said, there's a lot of interest in the role that our forests can play in mitigating or ameliorating, reducing climate change. I have to say that my real hope is that they can tolerate it. I think it's maybe a little foolish to think that forests are going to save us, and I'll tell you why. But this is undeniable. The forests right now are providing an incredibly valuable surface. They are offsetting about 11%, according to the most recent EPA estimates, of the greenhouse gas emissions we put into the atmosphere. Now, there have been all these proposals, Nature Conservancy in particular, to try to increase that sequestration, to increase the amount of carbon dioxide taken out of the atmosphere by our forests. And my question is that realistic, and can we count on it to continue? It turns out, for instance, that most of this carbon sequestration is in eastern forests. 85% of it is happening in the east because, as you all know from the news, the forests in the west are all on fire. So every one of the Rocky Mountain states is a net source. Their forests are losing carbon. They're a net source to the atmosphere. Oregon and Washington, until this year, were still carbon sinks. But it's really these eastern forests are where all of this, 85% numerically, of this carbon sequestration is happening. And so the question is, can we really do anything about that? And this is where, this is the slide that always gets used when anyone talks about this. And it's called, so the point is to ask, are there these natural climate solutions? What could we do to increase the amount of carbon taken out of the atmosphere by ecosystems so that we don't have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? And it's these two bars at the top that get all the attention: natural forest management and reforestation. But here's the thing, nobody reads the methods on these papers. These are academic papers done, and they are academic in the worst sense of the word, and that they're just hypothetical. But if you read the methods, so everybody looks at this and says, well, good, forest management could solve all of our problems. If we just managed our forest better, we could take all that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And if we reforest every non-forested acre that's not in agriculture, that would be even better. The problem is you have to read the methods, and when you read the methods, you find out that the way they get to this number is halting all logging in all forests in the United States for at least 25 years. Okay? I actually don't believe this number, even if they did that, and at least on the privately owned non-plantation forests. And they actually say, but we would make up the difference because of the yield from the forests we plant. But it takes 25 years to get the crop off of a forest. So how is it that we're going to halt all harvesting without destroying rural economies and get all this carbon out of the atmosphere while waiting for millions of acres of new plantations to be planted? And so this is why I got into a lot of trouble with the Nature Conservancy recently. As some of you may know, I was a trustee of the Adirondack chapter for 25 years. And the way this was going to happen was going to be a win-win for conservation. We were going to pay landowners to change their management to store more carbon And that money was going to come from Google and Disney and all the industries trying to offset their CO2 emissions by paying landowners to grow more trees. Well, it turned out that the methods allowed on those markets are fundamentally fraudulent. There's no other way to put it. They allow a gross exaggeration of the amount of carbon that can be stored or would be expected to be stored. And I finally wrote this up and annoyed a lot of people. But you know, if you're interested in this, it's a really difficult topic because there is the potential in some limited manner to get a win-win out of this, to have, you know, to change your management, to increase carbon sequestration, have someone pay you to do this. But I personally, at this point, see the problems as really intractable. And so I'll wrap up. So that, you know, conservation has always had, at least forest conservation, has always had this notion of this primeval condition that we need to try to restore. And as appealing as that is, I have had to abandon it. I no longer believe in it. I think we're going to have to accept that these forests are going to evolve and change. We need to be stewards of that change and manage it. And a lot of those changes are pretty baked in at this point. They're going to happen. There's almost no way to stop them from happening. And so there is no steady state out there. It's not like we just need to return to this condition where humans have left things alone. That's just not really in the cards anymore. But I really am still struggling. You know, I still, you know, I did my PhD in what was then thought to be the largest tract of old-growth forest in eastern North America, the Five Ponds Wilderness, although Barbara McMartin argues that there are hundreds of thousands of acres of functionally old-growth forest in the Adirondacks. But I have to tell you that beech was the dominant tree in most of those forests. And when I worked in the Five Ponds, 40 years ago now, or 40 more, there was no beech bark disease. Those forests were magnificent. And then a lot of them were blown down in 1995 by the storm. So, you know, yes, there's a great sort of emotional connection to this notion of these primeval forests. But we're going to have to come to grips with how we manage all this change going forward. So I appreciate your patience. That went on way too long. I'll stop there and take any questions. Yeah.
Yes, a number of the species are being impacted by pests of one kind or another. And, you know, plant species, I assume, are opportunistic. What do you see as the kind of the replacement species? Because if something's going to go into decline, something's going to emerge.
Red maple. So red maple is the most common. Red maple is the most common tree. I think I'll turn it off again. No. Red maple is the most common tree in eastern North America because it can grow from a ridgetop into a swamp, but it is also incredibly good at responding to disturbance. And you know, but Asian longhorn beetles love red maple if they get loose. But you're absolutely right. In fact, I've done a lot of research where the result is really depressing because it doesn't have the policy implications you hoped for. And you know, I'm a scientist. I can't hide from that. But I had funding for about 10 years from the federal government to try to document the economic consequences and ecological consequences of all these pests and pathogens. It was really depressing because, you know, all the hemlocks die. Yeah, you know, something else, you know, beech doesn't do well, but sugar maple does well. So something does, you know, there's a lot of functional redundancy in the sense that somebody is going to exploit the space left by the death of another species. So I have to say, to me, it's really an ethical issue. I just cannot tolerate losing another native species. It's just, you know, it's just not right. But I cannot, you know,
But the forest doesn't care.
The forest doesn't care. Well, there are lots of species that depend on that tree that we lost, that they do care. Actually, the real economic consequences are in cities. So, you know, if a hemlock dies in the woods and you hadn't intended to cut it down, it actually had zero economic loss. But if a white ash street tree, and remember white ashes were planted in almost every city in the Midwest when all the elms died, taking down that white ash tree on the streets of Toledo cost you $3,000 per tree. So that's actually where the huge economic losses are. A lot of cities in the Midwest almost went bankrupt during the early days of the emerald ash borer outbreak because their entire budgets were going to taking down dangerous dead trees. Is that a reason not to care that, you know, that there's no economic loss? No, not to me. Because eventually we're gonna lose something that well, we already are losing things I really care about. Yeah, Liz?
Charlie, I just want to bring your talk very close to home. I'm just curious. We are sitting here in the midst of approximately 14,000 acres of forest owned by Paul Smith College. Based on what you've just been telling us, does that matter in terms of climate change or, I mean, obviously there are nice things about having forests, but.
Well, I mean, do you only have forests to help solve? I guess I get really, the notion that we are going to depend on our forests to protect us from climate change, to solve climate change, when we know the problem with climate change is CO2 emissions from fossil fuel use, and we know the solution, which is to go to renewable energy, counting on forests and avoiding doing what we need to do doesn't make a lot of sense to me. There are too many, so for instance, this is the way this plays out, is that Massachusetts and Connecticut have proposed halting all logging on state forest land to maximize carbon sequestration. Well, I did the calculation for the benefit they would get from that. If they planted about 300 acres of solar farms across the two-state region, they would have better effects, and they would have eliminated all of the other pollution caused that they had allowed to continue by offsetting. And those forests provide all sorts of other values, you know, as managed forests. So the notion that we have to maximize the climate mitigation potential, to me, is just sort of backwards. I mean, we need to maximize their ability to tolerate and adapt to climate change, not to save us from our own, you know, folly. Any others? I'm happy to sit down. If there are no others, thank you, and thanks for coming out tonight.